right, welcome everybody to the August 16th meeting of the Gateway API Gamma Initiative. As normal, the Kubernetes Code of Conduct rules are in effect for this meeting, and it is being, yes, it is being recorded. I had to double check that. And yeah, I'm sharing the open agenda, which should be in the media invite and accessible to everybody here. So as always, it's an open agenda. So if there's something you want to discuss, please feel free to add it to the agenda. It should be documents that's editable by everyone. All right. So, and feel free to add yourself under attendees so we can keep track of who's showing up, please. All right, starting off. Keith, you had 2 announcements about upcoming sharing progress.
Yep. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Oh, I can't hear you.
Cool. Had some audio issues earlier. Yeah, so I just wanted to share out here again that we're going to be kind of delivering a status update to the greater Gateway API community on the August 22nd meeting that's a Monday, so next Monday. So if you want to hear, if you want to be a part of that, then mark that on your calendars. If you don't typically go to the greater Gateway API meeting, we'll be sharing out progress. So that's FYI.
Sorry, I missed most of that. My headphones weren't working.
You're doing a status update. Show up if you want to be a part of that.
All right. And is that something that we want to try to put together like a short doc in advance of that, like async, just to collaborate on what we want to report back?
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. I'll mark that as an action item for myself.
All right, and I'm happy to help out with that too. All right. Update on GAP 1324, which has a number now, on trying to build consensus on some of the like high level mesh goals before we spend too much time in the implementation details.
Oh yeah, I'm still off mute. Yes, so I started a Google Doc for some of that work, and funny enough, that GEP came out of a Slack discussion. So really big believer in using Slack for some of these conversations. Anyway, that we've since kind of moved that conversation from Google Docs into a PR, and I'm hoping to get the PR merged relatively soon, before August 22nd is kind of the time box there. And it was a pretty useful experience for me, at least, to spend some time thinking about those high level goals before trying to kind of solve the 2 cornerstone, not solve, but try to write about the cornerstone problems that we are dealing with as far as mesh representation and service and backend binding. So take a look at that. I kind of see this GEP as a bit of the North Star. We've got some goals about what we want to try to accomplish in this initial sprint, and some non-goals to keep in mind as we're doing design, as well as some deferred goals. It's at the bottom of the GEP document below the glossary. Those deferred goals are things that we think will be very useful to have eventually in the spec, but they're not problems that we want to solve immediately. And there's a lot more discussion needed, especially around egress gateway. That came up in the Gateway API meeting yesterday. There's a lot of complexity as far as the semantics around that, and so we're deferring that for future conversation. And we've also got a set of use cases as well in the GEP to help help folks see the problem space. And I put a note there, like we're not necessarily committing to every single one of those use cases in this sprint. It's more of an exercise in helping folks to empathize with the eventual end users and personas that are going to be using this. So take a look at that. Feel free to add comments and review the PR. I think by around, if there aren't any outstanding issues by around Thursday or so, I'll be looking to other gateway API maintainers / leads to get this merged in.
Cool, thanks.
Sounds good.
Yeah, this looks like a great place to start, and definitely I think everybody involved, like, maybe read through some of the use cases, think about how those might apply to your specific mesh implementation. And if there's anything obvious missing there, feel free to try to add it so that we can kind of align on common scope. All right, Flynn, you want to talk about a potential meetup at KubeCon NA coming up?
How many people will be at KubeCon NA? Seems like, a lot of us are going to be there. So yeah, we should probably get together and do something. I don't know if it needs to be something formal or if we just want to try to toss something on the calendar to get together and have a drink or two. But yeah, that seems like there will be enough of us there that it might be worthwhile.
I know that there is a general gateway API event of sorts that is being planned potentially. Rob, do you want to? I know we just had a meeting yesterday and it's early, but do you want us to kind of briefly restate what we chatted about yesterday at the Gateway API meeting?
Yeah, so I've been talking with Bob Killen and Jason from I don't know, I guess Kubernetes community, but they have been trying to find some community spaces. The easiest day for them to find community spaces is on Tuesday of the conference, which falls between the Contributor Summit, which most, if not all of us, are welcome to. If you're a Kubernetes org or Kubernetes SIG org member, you're more than welcome at the Contributor Summit. I think many of us will be there. And if you're not, we can help you get to that membership. So that's on Monday. And then Tuesday is an open day for many of us. I know it unfortunately overlaps with Service Mesh Con, which will be for many of the people on this call, something that they're attending. But it is a day that we can get space somewhere in the venue specific for Gateway API.
Tuesday, kind of later in the day, seems like it could work out.
Yeah, so
after Service Mesh Con is over.
Yeah, I think that's probably the winning option right now. So they don't have specific times for us yet, but what they've said so far is early next week, we should have a better idea. So I'll try and send an update out as far as what our options are. And yeah, hopefully we can all get together. It'd be great to meet many of you for the first time in person.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Looking forward to it. All right. So we have a relatively short agenda today. Is there anything else that folks wanted to add, or would it be useful potentially now to take some time to walk through GEP 1324?
Sorry, I lost your audio in the last phrase of that sentence.
Oh.
To walk through what?
To walk through the high-level mesh goals GEP. Unless there's any other agenda items that folks would like to add at this point.
The only stuff that's on my mind is kind of related to the GEP goals anyway, so. Anybody else? Anybody?
Yeah, I'm good to walk through that GEP. I kind of hope to try to do that during this meeting, but definitely didn't want folks if the agenda was already crowded. So I'm happy to fall back onto that.
Would you like me to turn screen share review?
Yeah, we can do that.
All right.
All right, let's see. You have to give me permission since you're the host. see how our Zoom foo is. Morning.
Figuring this
Ready
out
to
for the
bring
first
power.
time.
You said what?
So figuring this out for the first time. There we go. We should be all set now.
Thank you very much. All right, can folks see my screen?
I think a little bigger would probably help.
Yes, and let me actually, instead of reading through Markdown, which is always so quote unquote fun, I'm going to go to the Netlify preview. Very thankful for the devs that built that GitHub GitHub action. So I'll do a little bit of Zoom work here.
Just make your window
Uh,
narrower. That'll take care of it.
Like that.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
So no problem. All right, so this is the rendered version of the GAP. And just as an overview for what we're trying to kind of accomplish, Gateway API represents the next generation of traffic routing APIs in Kubernetes. And while most of the current work for Gateway APIs focus on the ingress use case, we want to try to support service mesh implementations with the spec. The community would benefit from that. And so this GEP is kind of a genesis for developing common patterns using Gateway API for east-west traffic within a mesh implementation. And I feel like it's important to call out here that this GEP purposefully doesn't promise new resources. It doesn't promise new implementations or anything like that. We are simply looking for patterns, and if new resources are necessary, then we'll add new resources. If we find that the current API is sufficient for the use case, then we'll use those. And so speaking of goals, there are kind of 6 top level goals that I think are, and please stop me with questions or if I'm rambling. But there seems like there are 6 kind of top level goals that kind of have come out of our early discussions. We want to augment the Gateway API with the necessary, keyword necessary there, models, resources, and modifications so that the XRoute primitives are usable by the service mesh implementations. The XRoute being HTTP route, TCP route, TLS route, etc. Those really, correct me if I'm wrong, those seem to be the real lifeblood of the Gateway API. And I think the community would benefit from being able to use that same family of resource for north, south, and ingress, and then east-west per mesh. You want to make sure that Gateway API ingress implementations can coexist and interoperate with mesh implementations. There's no interoperability, there's a breaking change there, then why are we doing any of this? So felt like that was important as a top level goal. We want to remain agnostic as to the topology of mesh implementations data planes. We don't want to pigeonhole anybody into this only works for sidecars, or this only works for non-sidecars. It should be topology agnostic. We want to enable mesh implementations to have vendor-specific extensions for their own policies, et cetera, that are in line with the existing extensibility offered by Gateway API. That's a fancy way of saying that policy attachments should, implementation should be able to use policy attachment to add their own policies. They shouldn't be locked into any such resources that are provided by Gateway API, Gamma, et cetera. We want to cooperate with the greater Gateway API community on shared patterns and policies that are applicable for both use cases, like authorization policy, right? If there's authorization policy resource, it's likely that users will want to use that same resource or pattern for both the ingress and the service mesh use case. And so we're possibly want to strive to cooperate so that that can be a reality. And then finally, we want to maintain the integrity of the namespace boundary for traffic routing and policy, and make explicit those instances where users will define exceptions. SMI and Gateway API and different mesh implementations all kind of have their own way of going about doing handling RBAC, the greater RBAC permissions models for adding routes, detaching routes, and configuring things in general. We want to make sure that we leverage the existing kind of boundaries that exist in Kubernetes with namespaces, and make sure it's explicit where that boundary is being broken. So open for discussion with these goals. Anything that we feel like is missing or we need clarification on or just completely disagree with, the floor is open.
I would add the definition of the mesh. I mean, what are the goals of the mesh security, secure communication between pods or whatever we agreed, because it's weird to have goals for something that is not defined. Few words.
Okay.
I mean, mesh is X. I don't know what it is, but maybe you do.
Okay. What I heard from that is you feel like it's important for us to have some language about what service meshes seek to accomplish. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
As an intro, I mean, I know you have the definition and you go into details, but hey, we want to have secure communication or whatever, controllable network or however you want to define it. So we have common context.
Okay. So let me think about that. And somebody else feel free to jump in as well. So like you said, we've got the definitions for mesh here. And you talk about a mesh as any component that is capable of adding functionality to the user request. I don't know. I wonder about the cost benefit of being more explicit about mesh goals in this document.
Can we just say that a mesh is, you know, a thing that is explicitly meant to be managing east-west communications and providing application isolation?
That's good enough. I mean, we need to agree. I mean, it's very hard to make progress and design something when you don't know what that something is. And I know we each have a different idea about what the mesh is. I mean, is security part of the mesh? I don't know. We don't agree. Is communication okay? If that's a minimum that we agree on, let's state it. So we have a base. I hope.
Worth
Yeah, I
noting,
think
I
it might-
literally said that after like 5 seconds of thought. So please don't take any of that as particular gospel.
I don't know. I know where we stand and why we are in this situation, because each vendor has different goals, different priorities. But we need, you know, to agree on a lot of APIs and policies. We should put at least a list that we agree on from you know, if controlling traffic flow is what the minimum we agree on, let's state it. That's a minimum goal.
Yeah, I think it might help to be more explicit about that, of just like the traffic control, because I know that John has discussed the preference, at least initially, for leaving out the like mesh security stuff, because that may differ between meshes. Some may use something like WireGuard security east-west traffic. So listing that as an explicit non-goal also might help clarify the scope here.
Sorry,
Security
security in the sense of, you know, allowing for automatic end-to-end encryption, or security in some other sense. Okay.
Yeah, the automatic, like trying to like basically deferring that implementations may have different ways of automatically securing traffic for east-west service communications that are probably not the most valuable thing for us to address in an initial iteration of this spec.
But I wouldn't put it as a non-goal. It's a deferred goal to ensure interoperability between secure network, secure meshes, but definitely not in the first iteration.
So so it sounds like traffic routing is definite, like within the scope, it's part of the scope of mesh as we're considering mesh. The automatic end-to-end encryption is, yeah, I'm kind of with Costin here. I don't know if I say that it's a non-goal, but I feel like it's explicitly an implementation detail that may vary.
Yes.
Do we agree that a mesh should arrange for end-to-end encryption no matter how it does it, or at least make it possible? I feel like that's a really important part of isolating applications within your cluster.
Yes, I think that's, but how you interoperate, that's, we agree to defer that.
Yeah,
I mean,
I definitely think we should defer any discussion of interoperability between message. Wow. Yeah, I can speak English. Really, I can. Interoperability between meshes.
Okay. So the only thing that I'll say, and this is kind of just as an asterisk, like nota bene kind of situation, is I just want to make sure that we don't overload the definition of mesh to mean too much. I think that saying that a mesh should have a way to handle traffic control, a mesh should have a way for end-to-end encryption. These are considerations that we need to be aware of. I'm fine with that, but I'm also very conscious of we don't want to exclude meshes that may either may not be there yet, or they be on something else for that implementation, and that we don't put too much into the definition of mesh. Because I think of something like chaos mesh. I'm not extremely familiar with it, but the goal seems a bit different for that mesh. Should they be able to use Gateway API? I would hope so. So just I'm in favor. I'll make those changes if someone wouldn't mind adding a PR comment just to make sure I can recall what we're wanting to do here. Either a PR comment or a note in the agenda doc. Just want to be cautious moving forward about overloading the definition of mesh too much. Any
If
other
I can
questions?
Looks
Go
like
ahead.
Mike is adding a comment. So I think that, I don't know if this belongs here in goals or in use cases or someplace else in this doc. I really would like to capture at some point in here that it should be possible for somebody who is a cluster provider to automatically spin up a mesh for somebody using the cluster. I think it's important to also clarify that it still needs to be possible for somebody who's just using the cluster to do it all without the help of a cluster provider. And again, I don't know where a good place to put that is.
Do we have a personas section yet?
No, but I think that would be a great addition to this.
Yeah, I've seen similar sections. I don't know if it's been in these gaps or other ones, but I mean, the Gateway API website itself has a good persona section on like administrator, cluster operator, app developer.
Right.
It's like,
I think it was,
yeah, it's
well,
somewhere on
it was
here.
kind of up
somewhere
at the, if you back up one, well,
like this yeah,
Yeah.
something like this.
it's kind of implicit there, but at least it's, described, right?
Yeah, okay, where is the sphere of influence for this persona? What kind of resources? Yeah, that makes
Right.
sense. Yeah, so I wonder. So my initial thought process when I hear that a cluster user can install a mesh without a cluster operator. Maybe I'm just assuming too much, but I feel like that's more. I thought those personas more have to do with back permissions than they do the role that they serve at the organization. Like if anybody who has the ability to do, for example, a Helm install, can, for our purposes, kind of is a function to do so, whether or not that's their function or organization. Yeah, I'll pause there. John, you have a hand? Can anybody
Can't
else
hear
hear
you,
John?
Cannot hear you, John. Sorry. I can
Still
hear you,
not
but
coming
you're
through for
really
me.
quiet.
I guess while John's figuring that out, anybody have any other responses to what I was just saying?
It may just be a matter of clarifying the roles some more. It may also be a compliance point where it would be really nice to be able to have a Gamma mesh be compliant with Gamma without requiring it to fulfill everything or compliant in some fashion without requiring that it fully implement all the cluster provider infrastructure stuff. That's something that we ran into. There's some friction with Gateway API as a whole. So that's kind of why it's on my mind.
For some clarity, are you defining cluster provider as like a managed offering, i.e. something like
So
versus like within a company team?
So when I got started with Kubernetes, it was in a company that consisted of 4 people. And there was nobody that I could, it was not an option to be able to sit down and go, oh, I'll talk to the company's cluster administrator about this. It was just me or, one of the other guys who was busy working with other stuff. It would be a beautiful world to be able to just, fire up K3D with the -- mesh equals whatever option. But even in that world, it's going to be important as an app developer or somebody wearing a multiple hats, particularly in a smaller organization, to be able to say things like, well, okay, this mesh isn't quite supported by Gamma yet, but I want to play with it. Or, I need an easy way to go and try the alpha version of the mesh that is supported, things like that, where explicitly requiring that there always be somebody at the infrastructure level to assist with things like that feels like it closes the door to a bunch of the smaller orgs and a bunch of that experimental stuff. John, can we hear you now?
I think so.
Yeah, awesome.
Cool. Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like we may be scope creeping quite a bit. Mesh is a gigantic field. That's why we all have jobs. We can't solve everything and kind of create some new standardized way to solve everything. I really think that we should focus on the core stuff and things like deployment. Maybe we tackle that, but that's also the hardest thing. Like that's something that even for Ingress has not been tackled. Like how do you actually deploy your Ingress controller is nowhere on the Gateway API spec today.
So maybe what we ought to do is just explicitly list it as, defining deployment models as a non-goal or a deferred goal.
Yeah, I think the deferred goal list should probably be like a page long. And the goals list should probably be like two or 3 points. Just so that we keep ourselves focused. Because it's really easy to say like,
yeah.
I mean, you look at, mesh docs, like there's, 100 pages of stuff. There's tons of stuff we can do. And we should do it at some point, maybe. But if we try and do all that, it'll be really hard.
Yeah, I guess, and I'm fine with listing that as a deferred goal. Yeah, I'm fine with listing that as a deferred goal with the proviso that I think that we should understand that that implicitly means that we're going to accept multiple deployment models, and that's okay.
One thing that should be a goal probably on this topic is that admin should be able to, override, prevent users from messing up and this kind of stuff. So while each individual creating its own mesh and deploying its own mesh may be a deferred goal, having a strong control probably is included in the namespace isolation, or I don't know if we have it explicit or we want to have it explicit, but I feel that if your security is part of the goals, we probably need some sort of admin controls.
Is that separate from Kubernetes RBAC? I mean,
maybe not. Maybe I don't know.
I'm sorry. I think I cut you off, Keith.
I was going to say the same thing. Like, I think I'd probably prefer for that to live like within, like implicitly within boundary, and the controls that Kubernetes provides around RBAC. Like those have kind of served the community well for years at this point, and our permissions is a non-trivial problem, and so I like to let Kubernetes solve that for us wherever possible. So that's kind of where I feel and why I've got that explicit goal of namespace boundaries. To make sure I remember, let me pull up in a different tab the agenda to make sure I have everything noted. We have a deferred goal of deployment models. From the chat, it's in the chat about multi-cluster. That seems like a pretty good deferred goal. Was there another one that I'm blanking on?
Multi-cluster from the chat.
Multi-cluster
goal. Yeah, anything off Kubernetes to be on serverless.
Okay, so like heterogeneous deployment models in general.
Yep.
Not just multi-cluster. So okay, so multi-cluster might be worth being separate, but okay, yeah, I'll add those to the GEP. And those are really good. I appreciate everybody's feedback there. John, you mentioned scope creep. Was there anything in the existing goals that you felt was scope creep, or are you more talking about the conversation at that time?
I think the current one seemed good, but I've also lost the page that showed. So
Okay.
yeah, I would just say like I think that's good. Although I would say that we shouldn't necessarily try and tackle everything in parallel. Like the top stuff is probably more important than the bottom stuff. Well, I guess it's kind of out of order, but you know, we don't need to solve every goal at the same time, even if they're not deferred goals, right? They can be this month and the
Yeah.
next month or something. So, like, it will be very hard to solve anything if we don't have a way to, like, do the basic of just routing, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. Any other comments or conversation we want to have before chatting about non-goals?
Maybe some mention of iterative development or releases. So basically, let's agree on how to bind routes to services or whatever it's called, and kind of do small steps so we don't block on having all the first goals. But once we reach a goal, we can have implementations, try it out, ship it, whatever. I don't know how we want to proceed with the release cycle, or how we achieve the goals one by one, or we wait until a group of 5 it's achieved, or.
Wow, yeah, that is a great question. Go ahead, Mike. Yeah.
Sure. So this is something where I don't think that we necessarily need to like all work on the same goal at the same time. I'd love if Rob, you have a little bit to share about kind of like what you've seen work well in Gateway API for North-South. But like one of the things that has seemed to help there is having like 1 or 2 people like take the lead as like owners of a thing and try to like work on driving consensus and driving like initial like get for that thing, rather than trying to have a half dozen or more people all focusing on one problem at the same time.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I would be careful to split things out as small as possible within reason. We certainly still have things to learn with Upstream Gateway API, but that's one thing that has helped is if you can get people who are really wanting to drive a specific area. It may seem small, but nothing is really that small when you're trying to build consensus across a group like this. So, yeah.
So that raises an important question. Are we shipping an API without implementations, or are we, basically agreeing on something, wait for a couple of vendors to implement it, and then we ship it when it has an implementation, or few implementations? I don't know what's the flow we want. For Kubernetes, it had at least 2 implementations when it shipped. I'll be very reticent to have, kind of APIs or definitions or protocols without, at least 2 implementations, because, they're not anchored on reality.
Yeah, so I'm also interested in hearing from Gateway API maintainers on how that experience was in the early days when you're trying to develop a specification. I know for SMI, when we were doing stuff, we didn't really have kind of implementations, and that may have been a one of the areas of improvement with that process. But I do think because of where Gateway API is as a spec, we might be able to get away with adding things because we're adding patterns to an existing spec. We may be able to get away with let implementations adopt, and then we've got a pretty good diverse spread in this group that I'd hope to try to catch some of the like dire incompatibilities during this process. But I'm also aware that we're not going to be able to get everything. So I think it was John, then Rob.
Yeah, just throwing out my suggestion. It seems like it would make sense. Obviously, when we're discussing if there's things that are expected to be incompatible, please let us know as soon as possible. But it seems like, once we have something that's reasonable, we could merge it as experimental and then have the implementations pick it up. And then, all's good, we move on. It's hard to have, kind of a chicken and egg problem. So at least from our side on Istio, we have an experiment of Mesh with Gateway. It's not what will be the end result. So I think we can at least iterate quickly. I don't know if others are in the position, where they have to start reading the APIs entirely and it's harder to adopt. but that would at least give one implementation that can quickly do it. And I believe some others are in the same state. So I think that we will be able to do that pretty quickly as well, to at least get something that we can try rather than reading the docs.
I think that's a good point. We didn't have experimental back in the day. I mean, everything was experimental. We're in a slightly different place now. So we need to recognize that. I would highlight a couple things. One, as John mentioned, we can release to experimental. There's the understanding that something like an experimental can include breaking changes at any point. With that said, it seems like it could be helpful when evaluating a gap, when evaluating a host of proposals, if someone had a work in progress, unreleased implementation of it that said, hey, yeah, this actually is feasible. This is something that can work. Definitely not something that should, take a lot of time, but just if more than one implementation can say, yes, this would work for us, I think that helps a lot. But we have the experimental channel for a reason now. I would encourage releasing all new things there, and we can break things if we need to. We definitely did break things. There was V1 Alpha 1 of the API, and then a number of breaking changes between V1 Alpha 1 and 2. So, yeah.
So experimental is fine for experiments, but my point was before something moved from experimental to a later phase. My experience is with Java spec and with the IETF. Usually, the purpose of of this group is to agree between at least two vendors or three vendors, so to create agreements across vendors. Istio, as John said, we can move probably very fast and implement whatever, and create experiments reflecting our APIs, and I'm sure other vendors can do the same thing. Right? The goal is to create this agreement and have at least two different vendors agree on something. Instead of each vendor pushing their own API into experimental and then trying to push them, further. That's why I propose to have a barrier of two vendors agree, then move forward. Otherwise,
Yeah, I completely agree with that. If there's something in the upstream gateway API that we can kind of umbrella under when it comes to kind of channel gates as far as vendors and implementations, if that exists, I'd love to just use that, because I think that needs to be a big part of moving anything from experimental to the regular channel.
Yeah, so I threw a link in chat to our versioning guidelines. One of the things, I think this is kind of what Costin was asking for here, is that as a part of getting to beta, we require that feature is implemented by several implementations and that there are some conformance tests in place. We can adjust those requirements, but I think that's really what you're talking about, Costin, of we need more than one implementation to have implemented something before we get it to beta. And I think most of the resources we're talking about modifying here are beta resources. So something would start an experimental, and then to get to standard, it needs to meet all the beta graduation criteria.
Great question. Really happy to have that conversation. Okay, so
I should also point out that Linkerd has some early gateway API stuff as well, but I'm not the guy to commit the engineering group to rapid iteration right today, right?
But it's something that it should be raised actually. I know each vendor has its own implementation in progress. It would be also worth to coordinating when we promote. I mean, to have everyone have at least some basic implementation, so we don't kind of compete too much in speed to market or other things, as a internal agreement or something.
okay. So if there's nothing else, they want to briefly just go over these non-goals. Hopefully, nothing too controversial here. But obviously, I think one of the non-goals of this effort is to represent every service mesh feature within Gateway API. Like John mentions, if you look at mesh documentation, they are many pages long, and bloating the Gateway API is definitely not one of the things that we want to result out of this. I also, one of the other non-goals is we don't want to duplicate concerns for the sake of mesh-specific resources. So if exists something within Gateway API that does what we want, the XRoute family of resources are a good example. Those exist. We don't want to duplicate that just to create mesh copies of everything. And then thirdly, kind of the, I forget if it's the converse or the inverse, but the kind of antithesis of that is we don't want to overload existing Gateway API mechanisms when a new mechanism is more appropriate. And so those kind of, I feel, bookend the extremes of ways to go about doing this. And hopefully the end result of that is we are asking ourselves these questions. Does it make sense to split these resources, either for user experience, user understanding, or technical difference? And then also, does it make sense to maybe use the source here so that we don't create, so that we don't create bloat in the spec? Relatively short. Do we feel like there's anything missing, or do we have any comments or disagreements on what we've got present here? All right. Thankfully, that was short. As far as open questions, these are kind of like deferred goals, but I didn't necessarily like the idea of having them as goals. This should be indented a bit, but there's only really one question here around should creating a set of policy attachments for like what one might consider table stakes functionality for a mesh, like authorization policy, should that be a goal? And I'm not sure about that yet. I think, yes, it would be nice for there to be, one resource that makes sense across multiple implementations. But kind of along, if we have that, if we say yes to that question that we should, we have to have a conversation about what's the process and what's the logic for which features should have kind of a community supported implementation and which ones are left up to the vendor. Now, I don't feel like we're in the place to have that conversation yet, but I could be wrong. What are others' opinions around this?
First.
Sorry, what was that?
Oh, you can go first. I was going to ask you first.
I do not think that should be a goal. I think it is probably a nice thing to kind of bear in the backs of our heads as a nice to have, but I don't think it should be a goal. Just, I feel like it's too early still.
Cool. Yeah. So,
go. Sorry, you had your hand up. Go ahead, Mike.
So this has come up a little bit in the main gateway API discussions before, and I think it's documented, but it was basically proposed to like start with implementation specific policy attachments using a vendor prefix key, and basically a pattern of like, if we end up finding enough similarity there, then move to standardize rather than trying to standardize at the outset.
Yeah, I like that idea quite a bit.
And I can go because I think that's documented.
That would be great to find a source for that. If that's the case, and I like that idea in general, it's not documented. It sounds like that's a non-goal at this time instead of a deferred goal. Any disagreement on that? Okay, so my takeaway then for that, for the sake of this PR, is I'm going to move that as to the non-goal section, hopefully with a link to where that workflow of implementation first and then standardize, link to that in the in that non-goal section, And if it's not, if there's no link to explicitly like spell that out so that it's clear, I think that's going to end up, I think that's probably going to end up being best overall. And I think it will prevent us from the feature creep that is very easy to fall into when it comes to something as hefty as mesh. So good call out. I'll take that as an action item. Okay, well, that's basically the gap. There's, like I said, some use cases here and a glossary of terms. Oh, and I was remember the other action item. We wanted to clarify the service mesh scope as far as traffic routing, and that's not in the agenda docs or a PR comment. I will either chat or someone could add it. I really appreciate it to make sure I can address that. But yeah, that's the gap. If you have any other follow-up comments or things you want to take a look at, it's there. I muted myself by accident. It's there on GitHub, and I will make the changes and that we talked about today. Any other last comments on this?
Is there already a use case for wanting to do a zero downtime upgrade of the mesh itself, as well as of a given app? I saw one for a given application.
Ooh, mesh management is a interesting it's an interesting thing.
I'm assuming that use cases are not necessarily a thing that we expect to get everything in there, right? But
correct. So that's I think that's fair.
yeah, the mesh upgrade thing, you know, I mean, it may turn out to be something that's just kind of not affected by Gamma, but it, you know, it's a thing. It's a thing that people are going to need to do, and I think it might be nice to note as a use case.
I can see that. Costing?
Deferred, I hope. I mean, I agree. It should be a goal, but it should be deferred. But that raises the operations that you mentioned. Do we want to put in the deferred section something about, you know, what kind of metrics or whatever we can agree on, so to have consistent operations, so someone who's operating a mesh kind of doesn't have to learn to operate a different one, or I don't know. It's
So John and Mike have just pointed out that that upgrade ends up relating back to the deployment model. And yeah, so I'd be okay with that as a deferred goal as well.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. Metrics was mentioned, and that is a very interesting. Speaking as a problem space that is difficult, but
Oh, you broke up a lot there, Keith.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
For the moment.
Okay. We'll see if that continues. Metrics was mentioned, and that's an interesting problem space. One thing that just to mention that one thing SMI didn't have when we started trying to do this was OpenTelemetry. And I think OpenTelemetry starts to make that picture a little bit clearer about what a possible standard for implementation metrics looks like when comparing like what Costin was describing on the operational side of metrics for mesh migration or mesh upgrades or uninstallation. So yeah, just a fun call out. If it happens to be of interest to anybody, I would love for somebody to spend some time in that area and come teach me about what a possible metrics standard might look like.
It is something that has particularly been, I think, a lot of divergent behavior in different mesh implementations up until now. So that may be one of the more difficult areas to standardize, even if we see potential for convergence towards OpenTelemetry at some point in the future.
Yeah, that's why I said I want somebody to come and teach me, because I could take some time, but it would be a lot of investment, because it is a difficult problem.
But let's state it on the default goals to have a record for it. So.
All right. Well, thank y'all for your attention for me walking through the gap. I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing and turn the meeting back over to Mike.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up. It doesn't look like we have anything else on the agenda today. So just wanted to thank everybody for coming. Good conversation. I'm glad we had a chance to walk through some of this gap, and hopefully it sounds like we're pretty close to aligning on some of the goals here, and hopefully we can move to get this merged shortly. So yeah, thanks for your time. Let's all go 5 minutes early. Take care.
Thanks for writing all that down, Keith.